The rise of female auxiliaries in Nazi Germany. To understand why those women stood in that courtyard in 1945, why the flames of a burning uniform could shake them more than the thunder of artillery, we must return to the years before Germany began to crumble. Unlike Britain or the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany resisted mobilizing women for most of the war. Ideology insisted that the German woman belonged to home, family, and motherhood. But as the conflict deepened and the fronts expanded, that ideology collided with the hard mathematics of manpower. By 1942, the Wehrmacht was stretched thin across continents. The Luftwaffe was losing skilled personnel. Anti-aircraft defenses needed thousands of new operators. The communications networks linking Berlin to every distant battlefield were growing too vast to maintain. Germany needed help, but only help that still fit within its worldview. Thus emerged the Wehrmacht's Helferinnen, the broad category of female auxiliaries assigned to the German armed forces. Their roles grew quietly, almost reluctantly. They wore uniforms, took oaths, and underwent training, not as combatants, but as support personnel essential to the machinery of war. The Luftwaffe recruited Flakhelferinnen, young women trained to assist anti-aircraft batteries. They plotted incoming Allied bomber formations, tracked them on radar screens, calculated firing solutions, and coordinated with gunners. Though they rarely touched a weapon, their work determined when flak guns fired and where. Many were teenagers when they started, some barely out of school. Others entered Nachrichtenhelferinnen units, signals auxiliaries. They operated telephones, radio equipment, encryption devices, and message relays. They sat in dimly lit rooms, listening through headsets, while the war's lifeblood pulsed through cables and frequencies. Every movement of a division, every shift of a supply line, every coded instruction passed through hands like theirs. The administrative branches absorbed thousands more. They typed orders, issued rations, logged troop movements, maintained personnel files, tasks without glamour, but with enormous importance. They became the unseen architecture of Germany's war machine. And then there were the SS Helferinnen, women specially chosen for service in the SS communication networks and offices. Their uniforms carried sharper lines and darker associations. They worked primarily in headquarters and administrative centers, often unaware of the full extent of the organization's crimes, yet still bound by its authority. Their insignia carried a weight, and after the war, that weight would become fear. Regardless of unit, one thing united these women: the uniform itself. Grey wool tunics for the Wehrmacht, dark blue or black for the Luftwaffe, distinctive field caps, armbands, collar tabs, eagles and swastikas embroidered into cloth. A uniform was identity. It marked belonging, purpose, duty. For many, it represented the first independence they had ever tasted, leaving home, living in barracks, serving as part of something larger. Training camps reflected this new identity. Days began early with drills, instructions, technical exercises, and lessons in discipline. Indoctrination was subtle but constant. Young women were told they were supporting the nation, aiding soldiers on the front, defending their cities against foreign bombers. Many believed it. Others simply did their jobs because the war demanded it. Some joined willingly, some were pressured, some saw no other path. By late 1943, as Allied air raids intensified, their roles became even more crucial. In command bunkers beneath German cities, auxiliaries listened to the deep hum of radar screens, marked hostile aircraft on plotting tables, and relayed orders through narrow corridors filled with tension. The war had moved into the sky, and these young women were now deeply embedded in its machinery. Yet there was always a sense of distance between them and the front line, between them and the harshest realities of combat. Many believed the war would never touch them directly. They lived in a bubble built from routines, regulations, and the persistent rhythm of duty. But the bubble began to crack in 1944. As Allied troops pushed across France and Soviet armies advanced from the east, Germany's vast defensive networks began to fold. Communications broke down. Anti-aircraft positions were overrun, headquarters emptied, Trains crowded with refugees. Propaganda could no longer hide the truth, and the women who had served behind desks, radios, and radar screens found themselves suddenly exposed. Their uniforms, which once opened doors, now marked them as targets. In the final months of the war, as command structures disintegrated, many auxiliaries were left alone with their uniforms, their training, and the realization that defeat was no longer a whisper, but a certainty. They understood that capture was inevitable. What they did not expect was what the Allies would require of them in the days ahead. A moment that would strike at the very core of their identity. A moment that would come in the form of a simple, uncompromising order. And that moment begins to take shape as we move into the next phase of the collapsing Reich. Collapse of the Reich en masse. Surrender. By the final months of 1944, the German Reich was a nation fighting on momentum rather than strategy. Its armies were exhausted, its supply lines shredded, and its cities scarred by relentless Allied air raids. Yet inside many command posts, female auxiliaries continued their duties, passing signals, updating maps, logging destroyed units, in an atmosphere where denial and fear lived side by side. For these women, the collapse did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, a commanding officer failing to return from the front, a bunker losing power for hours, a signal line going dead, leaving entire regions in silence, a whispered rumor that the Soviets had crossed the Oder, a quiet admission that the Americans had breached the Rhine. Each fragment chipped away at the illusion that their positions were secure. As front lines crumbled, auxiliary units were ordered to withdraw. Some retreated in trucks with combat troops. Others dispersed on foot, carrying only satchels and the uniforms on their backs. Luftwaffe, Flakhelfer in an abandoned radar sites they had worked in for years. Communications auxiliaries left behind headsets still warm from their last transmissions. But nowhere was the fear greater than in regions threatened by the approaching Red Army. Stories filtered westward, stories of brutal reprisals, of SS personnel executed on the spot, of civilians attacked in the chaos. Many auxiliaries, regardless of their branch, understood that surrendering to the Americans or British meant far better chances of survival. Thus began an unprecedented movement across the collapsing Reich. Tens of thousands of German women in uniform moving westward, seeking the safety of Western Allied lines. For many, it was the first time they had seen the war unfiltered. They marched through rubble-strewn cities, past refugees pushing carts filled with everything they owned, past burned-out tanks and abandoned artillery pieces. The war they had supported from command bunkers was now all around them, uncontrolled, unpredictable, frighteningly real. By early April 1945, Western Allied forces encountered increasing numbers of female German POWs. The sight surprised many American and British soldiers. Few expected to find young women in uniform working for the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe. Some auxiliaries surrendered formally at checkpoints. Others approached Allied patrols with raised hands, shivering in early spring winds, clutching identity papers or prayer books. And here, a new problem emerged: their uniforms. To the auxiliaries, a uniform was simply a requirement of service, something they wore every day, often without thinking. But to Allied forces, uniforms carried legal meaning, political symbolism, and security risks. A grey tunic might hide an SS affiliation. A Luftwaffe collar tab might mask involvement in anti-aircraft crews that had shot at Allied bombers. An armband or insignia could signal rank or association with organizations now considered criminal. American commanders in particular faced a dilemma. They needed to process large groups of surrendered women efficiently and safely. They needed to separate ordinary auxiliaries from intelligence personnel and SS staff. And they needed to prevent any possibility of sabotage, escape, or false identity claims. The solution that emerged in many Western Allied POW processing centers was direct, immediate, and symbolic. Strip the uniforms of all insignia, confiscate them, destroy them. This was not universal policy everywhere, but it occurred widely, especially where SS symbols were present or where units were mixed, making background checks difficult. In some cases, destruction meant cutting insignia from tunics. In others, it meant burning entire piles of uniforms under guard supervision. For many women, this order came as a shock more profound than the surrender itself. Their uniforms were the only possessions they had retained through the collapse, symbols of a duty they believed they had fulfilled, regardless of the war's outcome. Now even that identity was about to be taken away. Meanwhile, the logistical situation in the camps grew more complex. Allied commanders faced overcrowding, supply shortages, and the need to process thousands of POWs per day. Women who had served in roles far removed from ideological centers were now being held under the same authority as captured soldiers. Interrogations were brief, but necessary. Identification was inconsistent. Every insignia, badge, and collar tab had to be examined. And the longer these women remained in camps, the more the uniform became a burden rather than a badge. It marked them in a world that was rapidly deciding who had served, who had obeyed, and who had participated. By the final days of April and early May 1945, destruction of uniforms, especially those containing Nazi symbols, became not just a practical decision, but an early step in what would soon become a massive Allied policy effort, the denazification of Germany.
But for the women standing in those camps, the order felt less like policy and more like a final break with the world they had known.
The Reich was gone. Their service was over, and soon even their uniforms would disappear into flame. And from this moment of collapse emerges the deeper complexity of the story, one that must be understood from multiple angles. For the women standing in Allied custody, the surrender had already been a shattering moment. But the order to destroy their uniforms touched something deeper, something rooted not in politics, but in identity. Many of these auxiliaries had been barely 18 when they entered service. Their uniforms had given them structure, belonging, a sense of purpose during the most turbulent years of their lives. Wearing them meant discipline, work, camaraderie, and, above all, certainty. In the camps, that certainty evaporated. Some felt humiliation. Others felt disbelief. A few, hardened by training or ideology, reacted with short, sharp bursts of anger before falling into silence. But the majority felt something far more complex, a sudden loss of self. For years they had lived inside a hierarchy that defined everything: rank, responsibility, behavior, even morality. Now that hierarchy was gone, replaced by unfamiliar orders from men who spoke another language, represented another nation, and held absolute authority. Removing the uniform was more than removing cloth. It meant stripping away the final link to a role they had occupied throughout the war. Many auxiliaries had served far from combat, yet they had still been part of a system that shaped their daily lives. Their service had given them a place in a world ruled by discipline and structure. Captivity replaced it with uncertainty. As the moment grew near, some women held their tunics tightly before placing them on the growing pile. Others hesitated, staring at insignia stitched by their own hands or pinned on during their first day of service. A few tried to secretly remove small badges as mementos, only to surrender them when ordered. The courtyard atmosphere became heavy with tension, not rebellion but resignation. In this fragile psychological state, the order took on the weight of finality. It was the emotional pivot between who they had been during the war and who they would become in the unfamiliar, uncertain world that followed. And while the emotional response was deeply human, the Allies' reasoning behind the order was far more tactical. To the Allied officers processing thousands of German POWs daily, the uniform was not a sentimental artifact. It was a security risk. In the final weeks of the war, misinformation, sabotage attempts, and false identities were common concerns. Distinguishing ordinary auxiliaries from committed Nazi loyalists required rapid, systematic measures. Uniforms complicated everything. A Wehrmacht tunic looked similar across different branches. SS Helferinnen sometimes wore standard-issue garments with only small insignia distinguishing them. Luftwaffe auxiliaries could be confused with personnel tied to anti-aircraft units that had shot down Allied bombers. Insignia identified rank and role, but only if it was intact and genuine. Some women tried removing insignia to claim lower status. Others hid documents out of fear of harsher treatment. Allied commanders needed clarity. Removing the uniforms prevented escape attempts by blending in with civilian populations. It eliminated the possibility of auxiliaries using rank or insignia to exert influence within camps. It also reduced the visual presence of Nazi symbols, which held the potential to embolden certain prisoners or cause conflict among groups. In some facilities, mixed units of surrendered soldiers and auxiliaries made it even more important to eliminate any symbols of authority that might disrupt order. Burning the uniforms solved multiple problems at once. It removed the symbols of a hostile regime. It prevented impersonation or movement outside the camp. It eliminated the need to store, transport, or secure large quantities of German military clothing. It ensured that SS-affiliated women could not hide their involvement by altering or discarding insignia later. To Allied officers, the measure was practical, efficient, and aligned with emerging denazification policies. But those reasons, however logical, did not ease the emotional impact on the women themselves. Practicality to one side was personal loss to the other. Yet there was a deeper layer, one rooted in the symbolic power of uniforms in wartime Germany. In Nazi Germany, uniforms were more than clothing. They were instruments of identity. They shaped posture, behavior, and even belief. From school organizations to the highest ranks of the military, uniforms created a visual hierarchy that defined who someone was and where they belonged. The auxiliaries felt this deeply. Their uniforms had been markers of competence and recognition in a society where women had historically been confined to domestic roles. The cut of a tunic, the shine of a button, the placement of a badge, these details mattered. They represented hours of training, expectations of discipline, and an implicit promise that their service had meaning. Even those who were never ideologically driven found pride in their role, in being part of something structured during a chaotic era. Burning those uniforms attacked that symbolism at its core. As the flames consumed each garment, the women were forced to witness the erasure of an identity that had been constructed over years. Every insignia curling in fire meant the collapse of a role they had lived faithfully, even if that role had been shaped by propaganda and shaped within a system ultimately destined to fall. To some, the burning felt like punishment. To others, it felt like liberation they were not yet ready to understand. But for all of them, it marked the moment where individual service ended and survival in a defeated nation began. The symbolic weight of that fire now leads us into the broader set of perspectives that shaped this event from every side. To the American, British, and Canadian soldiers receiving mass surrenders in April and May 1945, the sight of German women in uniform was both unexpected and unsettling. Many frontline troops had spent years fighting German men, infantry, tank crews, pilots, but few had imagined that young women, some barely out of school, had played structured roles inside the military machinery they were dismantling. Some Allied soldiers felt sympathy. These women looked exhausted, frightened, and stripped of the confidence seen in earlier propaganda. Others felt mistrust. Uniforms, regardless of who wore them, represented a system that had brought devastation across Europe. And there were darker concerns as well. Allied intelligence warned that some SS women, particularly those tied to communications networks and training centers, might attempt to hide within broader auxiliary groups. This tension formed the backdrop to the uniform burning order. For many Allied troops, the act was not symbolic. It was precaution. They needed clear separation between civilians and anyone with military affiliation. They needed to ensure that no one could pass through checkpoints wearing recognizable insignia. They needed to reduce the visual presence of Nazi symbols in newly liberated areas where displaced persons and survivors of camps were still arriving, traumatized and furious. In some processing centers, Allied guards noted the women's discomfort with a mixture of detachment and understanding. One American sergeant later wrote that he observed dozens of German girls crying over coats and hats like they were losing a family member. Another British officer recalled that many auxiliaries seemed more shaken by the loss of uniform than by captivity, a remark that revealed a truth the Allies did not always grasp. These women had built their identities around service, and surrender tore that identity apart. Yet from the Allied viewpoint, caution was essential. Even in the last days of the war, small pockets of German resistance tried to continue fighting. A uniform, any uniform, was a symbol that could rally the wrong person. Thus, what the auxiliaries experienced as a personal loss, the Allies saw simply as a necessary step toward order and control. Behind every moment at the POW camps stood a chain of command, making rapid decisions. Western Allied leadership faced a situation no army in history had encountered: the sudden surrender of millions of enemy personnel, soldiers, officers, civil servants, Hitler Youth members, Volkssturm fighters, and now female military auxiliaries. Processing them required clarity and speed. Orders flowed down from regional headquarters to frontline units. Confiscate weapons and documents. Separate officers from enlisted personnel. Screen SS members. Remove and destroy Nazi symbols. Prevent impersonation or escape attempts. For women's camps, the directives evolved quickly. Initial reports described confusion. Auxiliaries arriving in mixed groups, some wearing incomplete uniforms, others carrying credentials from units that no longer existed. Allied commanders realized that relying on documents alone would be impossible. Many papers were forged, altered, or destroyed during retreat. The uniform, therefore, became the most visible and practical marker of affiliation. Leadership concluded that eliminating these uniforms would reduce internal tension within camps, prevent misidentification, and accelerate the process of returning non-combatant women home once interrogations were complete. The destruction also aligned with early steps in denazification, which sought to remove all visual traces of the collapsed regime from public life. For commanders, this was administrative logic. For the women who wore the uniforms, it was a loss far deeper than any regulation acknowledged. But leadership was operating under immense pressure. Towns were overflowing with refugees. Bridges had fallen. Food supplies were strained. The war might have been ending, but the logistical nightmare was only beginning. In this environment, symbolic gestures mattered, but efficiency mattered more. As Allied officers delivered the order, they rarely explained its purpose. They spoke with the clipped, firm tone of men who had no time for debate. And as the lines of women obeyed, leadership moved on to the next task, unaware, or perhaps simply unable to consider, how profoundly the order would be remembered. The moral terrain surrounding these women is one of the most complex chapters of the war's final days. Were they victims of circumstance, participants in a militarized regime, or individuals trapped in roles shaped by ideology, fear, and duty? History does not offer simple answers. Many auxiliaries viewed their service as administrative or technical work far removed from atrocities. They operated radios, typed reports, managed logistics, monitored radar screens, tasks common in any modern military structure. Some had joined out of patriotic enthusiasm, others because it offered food, stability, or escape from bombed cities. A number admitted they had simply followed expectations placed upon them in youth. Yet the system they supported was responsible for immense destruction. Even administrative service contributed to the machinery of war. The moral question, then, is not whether they pulled triggers, but whether they understood the regime they served. Post-war testimonies reveal a spectrum of awareness. Some women acknowledged they had believed in Nazi ideology when they were young and impressionable. Others insisted they were never political. Some admitted they had been warned about Soviet reprisals and thus clung to their uniforms as symbols of safety, symbols that became burdens once captured. A few carried guilt for having served in communications networks linked to military operations that cost countless lives. The Allies, too, faced moral complexity. They had no interest in humiliating surrendered women, yet they could not ignore the symbols these uniforms carried. The burning of uniforms became a moment saturated with ethical tension, the collision of personal identity with national responsibility, of individual fear with collective history. The flames that consumed those garments consumed more than fabric. They consumed illusions, loyalties, and the final remnants of a world that had promised certainty at a terrible price. And from these overlapping perspectives, human, tactical, symbolic, and moral, emerges the pivotal moment that brought all of them together. The instant when the order to burn the uniforms was given.